A long time ago in this galaxy, a really cool car, driven by high school student George Lucas, zoomed its way down the road. This young man's heart was full of nothing but dreams of becoming a race car driver. This rebel lived life in the fast lane until that life started to get a little too fast. And young Lucas found his really cool car wrapped around a tree, and his body clinging to life in a hospital for weeks. While recovering, George had time to think his life over. The doctors said that he should not have survived. That ride could have been his last. George had a sense that he was spared for a reason, and that his life had a new purpose. He wanted to tell stories and create things that were previously unimaginable. And he thought the best way to do this was to trade being behind the wheel for being behind a camera, taking the whole world for a ride through time, space, light, and magic. That's right, George Lucas became one of the most influential filmmakers in the galaxy. His cinematic creation became more than just cinema, more than just a movie, movies, a franchise, more than just a pop culture phenomenon. The films of George Lucas changed who we are as humans and/or Earthlings, consuming almost every aspect of our lives, at least every aspect of our wallets, whether we like it or not. And Jedi is pretty much almost an official religion now. I do not wish to make any blasphemous comparisons, but only a few people in history can say that. You know, that they created a popular religion. But later in the career of George Lucas, another crash came when he drove himself a little too hard, a little too close to the sun, and possibly destroyed his masterpieces, like a space wizard driven to the dark side. But his temptations were digital. And then, using that digital witchcraft, he changed cinema once again, for better or worse. You see, life and the universe, they have like a pattern, they like repeat themselves. You know, it's like poetry. It rhymes. But yeah, it's time to test out old boy George's midi-chlorians and see just exactly what the f*** happened to George Lucas.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme, every stanza kind of rhymes with the last one. Hopefully it'll work.
But to truly understand what the f*** happened to George Lucas, we must begin at the beginning, and the beginning began when he was born on his birthday, 1944, Modesto, California. As you know, George Lucas grew up with aspirations of becoming a race car driver until one fiery car crash ended all of that. And because this car stuff nearly killed him, he would turn his attention to the experimental films of Jean-Luc Godard, Federico Fellini, and François Truffaut, which gave him the inspiration to make his own narrative films using the 8mm camera that he had purchased to record his earlier underground races. George Lucas would attend the famed USC School of Cinematic Arts, where he would meet Steven Spielberg at a school film festival. As a young filmmaker, George Lucas would feature abstract visuals to evoke the emotions he wanted from the audience. Pushing the boundaries of that time, experimenting, willing to make mistakes and learn, the man is a true artist. But it was George Lucas's business-savvy ways that seemed to always be his biggest advantage, and talent and skill. He would use this opportunity to teach a film class to a bunch of Navy members at USC as a way to make the short film that would change his life forever. Electronic Labyrinth, THX 1138 4EB. Yes, that's the title. As an exchange for the class, the Navy footed the entire bill for color film stock and its processing, as well as using the students as crew. This short film would go on to win the National Student Film Festival, which would also see Lucas awarded a student scholarship by Warner Brothers Studios. That allowed him to pick any film currently in production to work on. George Lucas chose Francis Ford Coppola's Finian's Rainbow in 1968, where he soon became friends with Francis Ford Coppola, and this friendship would become very beneficial to both of them. After working as a camera operator for the infamous Rolling Stone concert film Gimme Shelter in 1970, Lucas and Coppola founded the production company American Zoetrope as a way to help filmmakers work outside the big studio system. This would help Lucas turn his award-winning short film into a feature film, cutting down the title a bit and calling it THX 1138, starring a very young, very bald Robert Duvall. Though now we look at this film as a science fiction classic, at the time it did split the critics. Some would compare it nicely to 2001: A Space Odyssey, while other pesky critics said that it lacked imagination, which is truly outrageous. I mean, just look at all this imagination. All there, look at that's imagination, right? All over the screen right there. So much imagination. Like, if anything, George has imagination. Perhaps those negative reactions to THX 1138 were because the cut of the film released to theaters wasn't exactly George Lucas's preferred cut, as Warner Brothers and their sister Dot took the film from George Lucas in the editing stage and handed it over to an in-house editor. But luckily, in 2004, George Lucas was able to fully restore his vision with a director's cut. And this is an actual director's cut that most people support. One of those, rare improvements when George tinkers with things. But yeah, THX 1138, this has gone down as one of the biggest cult classics in history. The cult is so big that it's not really even a cult anymore, just a classic.
Before 105. About the 521.
Next, George Lucas would take Francis Ford Coppola's advice and penned a screenplay that would have more mainstream appeal. You know, more mainstream than THX 1138. This would lead George Lucas to conceive a story about his childhood in the 1960s in California, and that film was American Graffiti in 1973. This is a truly amazing, beautiful film that is the perfect example of write what you know. It's also like an art house Happy Days. The screenplay to American Graffiti was set to very specific music cues, and the original studio, United Artists, saw what it would cost to secure the rights to all that rock and roll. They balked. They laughed. They said, "George, you're ridiculous. You're never gonna make it in show business," they said. After shopping the script to American Graffiti around to literally every studio in town, it would ultimately end up at Universal, with the studio giving George Lucas full creative control over the project, as long as he agreed to keep the budget in check. And that gamble worked, as American Graffiti has gone down as one of the most profitable films ever made. The budget was under $1 million, and it has made well over $200 million to date. George Lucas sure knows how to make money, even though he wasn't paid very much to make American Graffiti, but, you know, it would pay off later eventually, you know. It was a long-term investment. This would bring George Lucas his first 2 Oscar nominations for Best Director and Best Original Screenplay. Funny enough, his star, Ron Howard, would go on to direct Solo, a Star Wars story, decades later.
Why don't you go kiss a duck?
My God.
And when anybody ever criticizes George Lucas's ability to direct actors, when they say he can only direct robots and spaceships, I say no, actually, there's a movie called American Graffiti. Here it is, right here, watch it, and you will see that George Lucas does an amazing job at directing this incredible ensemble cast. George Lucas would return as executive producer for the 1979 unnecessary sequel to American Graffiti, which they called More American Graffiti. This time, Ron Howard had more facial hair, although that one could not quite capture the magic of the original. United Artists is no longer a studio, and you may be able to attribute that to the fact that they not only passed over American Graffiti, but they also passed over another treatment that George Lucas was working on at the time, what some people like to call a space opera. You know, the thing that would become Star Wars. George Lucas just wanted to make a movie that, he wanted to see. And he grew up loving those Flash Gordon serials. So originally, he wanted to just buy the rights to the character, Flash Gordon, and make his own movie, but he found out that those rights had already been purchased. So George Lucas thought, hey, I'll just be original and make up my own idea. He would use old Tarzan and John Carter of Mars books, as well as the 1958 Akira Kurosawa film The Hidden Fortress as inspiration, because in this epic black and white samurai masterpiece, there's a war going around and all this epic stuff is happening, but it's told through the eyes of two silly dudes who are, R2-D2 and C-3PO. There's also a princess. Not to mention, he was also greatly inspired by westerns, World War II footage and World War II movies, Greek mythology, and the hero's journey teachings of Joseph Campbell.
And the conditions of the environment match the readiness of the hero. The adventure that he's ready for is the one that he gets.
George Lucas says that his original script to Star Wars was much darker and more bleak. But with the failure of the dark and bleak THX 1138, he decided to lighten it up a bit and make it more adventurous and fun, because sometimes movies should be fun. The original script was titled The Adventures of Luke Starkiller. It was over 300 pages long and would ultimately serve as the guideline for the entire original trilogy. Everyone in Tinseltown passed on the script, but there was one guy who saw the true potential in George Lucas, and his name was Alan Ladd Jr., who was the head of the film division at 20th Century Fox at the time. Ladd would later admit that he really didn't understand this Star Killer script, but he had faith in George Lucas's vision. Ever the businessman, George Lucas was able to negotiate a pretty sweet deal for himself. In exchange for a reduced salary, he would maintain the rights to the entire Star Wars universe. And in one of the smartest moves in the history of deal making, George Lucas would successfully negotiate the rights to all the merchandising-related Star Wars material. But I think Mel Brooks said it best.
Merchandising, where the real money from the movie is made.
The film Star Wars would go into production and nobody thought it was going to be a hit. Because at the time, science fiction films had fallen out of favor to the public. Adventure, sci-fi, fantasy, it just wasn't cool at the time. Cinema was kind of stuck in a dark and gritty place, which, don't get me wrong, I love, but this man Lucas was able to bring a new hope to the movies again. But yeah, even George Lucas was pretty dang sure that Star Wars was gonna bomb, but he was determined to make it anyway. At the time, 20th Century Fox had disbanded their in-house visual effects department, which just led George Lucas to create his own. And that is how perhaps the biggest visual effects house in the world, Industrial Light and Magic, was founded. Like I said, nobody had faith in this thing, and the magic, it just wasn't felt during production. But like with many films, Star Wars was saved in the edit. chopping and cutting at exactly the right places to build perfect tension and suspense and joyful ecstasy. Star Wars would be released in 1977 and the world would change forever. It became an instant hit. Everyone loved the amazing visuals. Nobody had seen anything like that before. The camera movements, the storytelling, the characters. This movie changed the way we look at time and space and history and our souls and ourselves and each other and everything. George Lucas would go on to be nominated for Best Director and Best Original Screenplay, and Star Wars would be nominated for Best Picture, but it lost all of that to Annie Hall. But ultimately it all worked out, as Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope, as it was officially retitled in 1981, with Lucas explaining that he labeled it Episode 4 because he wanted the audience to feel like they had missed something and were being dropped in the middle of a story. But yeah, if you've probably figured out by now, Star Wars would go on to become probably the most influential film ever made at that time, from then on. But then maybe all of that success went to George's head and he was a little misguided, and I just blame his love of Christmas, I guess, when he made the Star Wars Holiday Special. It was a television thing, and it's so bad that it's pretty much unwatchable. You have to be really dedicated to sit through this. The animation part is pretty good though. But it is totally understandable that George Lucas tried to destroy and erase this from history. And unfortunately, because of this, George Lucas ruined Christmas for everyone. Forever. George Lucas then got word that his inspiration, his idol, filmmaker Akira Kurosawa, was struggling financially to finish his film Kagemusha in 1980. So George Lucas, with great honor and great respect, opened up his wallet so that Akira could finish yet another masterpiece. And because of this, George Lucas got an executive producer credit. Then, of course, it was time for a Star Wars sequel, The Empire Strikes Back, in 1981. George said that directing the original Star Wars was such a detriment to his health that he was not eager to jump back in for the sequel. Lucas would set up a writer's room at his new production campus Skywalker Ranch, bringing in Lawrence Kasdan to write the final draft. Lucas had absolutely no desire to direct The Empire Strikes Back, but he wanted to hire somebody who could make the film in their own way, while also recognizing that George Lucas was ultimately in charge. He would find that person in Irvin Kershner, who would go on to make a masterpiece of a film that many say is the best Star Wars movie ever made, and many of those people are right. But of course, Star Wars was not the only massively successful franchise that George Lucas's massive imagination created. While vacationing in Hawaii during the initial release of Star Wars, because he did not want to know if it was a bomb or a hit, he just wanted to hide in Hawaii. So George Lucas was just laying there on the beach with his buddy Steven Spielberg, and the two were just sitting around thinking, what have you always wanted to see in a movie? And they started throwing out ideas. They were like, I've always wanted a movie that would kind of homage those adventure serials that I loved as a kid, with a strong leading man who, fights Nazis, because I hate Nazis. You hate Nazis too, right? I also have always wanted to see a movie where the hero has a bullwhip and is an archaeologist. And so they put all of those ideas together and they created Indiana Smith. Because that was his name at first, and then they went with Indiana Jones. Probably because it sounds better. Steven Spielberg would ultimately direct this film, which would ultimately be called The Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was released in 1981 and would become that year's highest grossing film, with over $330 million. That's right, George Lucas knows how to get the gold. It's a wonderful adventure film full of beautifully directed action, with a character who is instantly iconic. This Spielberg and Lucas team, they sure did create something pretty gosh darn good.
Standgerecht. Steh auf!
1983 would see George Lucas write the screenplay and self-finance the third and final Star Wars film of the original trilogy, Return of the Jedi. He still had no interest in directing the film, bringing in director Richard Marquand. Of course, Return of the Jedi would go on to become the highest-grossing film of 1983, be nominated for 5 Oscars, and be selected to the Library of Congress National Film Registry in 2021. Although many people really don't like this one, and it has been criticized for being too commercial. I don't know, I think this one gets a little more hate than it deserves. It's still a thrilling adventure, and I was satisfied with that happy ending. After producing the animated film Twice Upon a Time, George Lucas would reunite with Steven Spielberg for Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom in 1984. Many have noted that this sequel-prequel felt a bit darker and more bleak than the previous adventure, while also feeling more like a kid's movie at the same time. The tonal changes are confusing, but that's actually why I like it so much. The violence and the darkness of Temple of Doom would lead to the creation of PG-13, because only 13-year-olds are mature enough to watch you eat monkey brains. Sure, he came up with some really great stories, but the man is a genius at the art of business, making that money. And that really shined with his production company, Lucasfilm, along with his audio company, THX. You know the sound. Oh yeah! He would executive produce such cult classics as Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters, Jim Henson's Labyrinth, and the Marvel movie Howard the Duck, which has gotten a reputation for being just a horrible piece of crap, but it's actually a fun piece of crap. George Lucas was also involved in the animated classic The Land Before Time. Lucasfilm would also produce the animated series Droids and Ewoks, and 2 Ewok feature-length movies for some reason. And he even helped his old friend Francis Ford Coppola make the movie Tucker, A Man and His Dream in 1988, when Coppola was experiencing some financial difficulties. George Lucas would also provide the story for the fantasy classic Willow, and would return to the world of the archaeologist who punches Nazis when he crafted the story for Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which was supposed to be the last one. It has the perfect ending. They literally ride off into the sunset, the end. But we'll get to that later. But yeah, once again, another movie that George Lucas's huge imagination created went on to become the highest grossing film of that year. And he would bring the world of Indiana Jones to the small screen back when TVs were smaller with the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles in 1993. It was around this time that George Lucas started to notice the vast advances in visual effects over the years, and he decided that now was the best time to finally realize his true vision for his Star Wars films. This would lead to the Star Wars Trilogy Special Edition. This would release 1 film a month in January, February, and March of 1997. Of course, these special editions were met with much controversy when George Lucas decided to alter and ruin many scenes of the original, adding in a lot of unnecessary CGI that covered up the original.
George Lucas has been able to restore and enhance his classic trilogy and present it as he has always meant it to be. The Star Wars Trilogy Special Edition.
But then George Lucas did what is almost an unforgivable sin. He altered the story and character motivations, especially when he made bounty hunter Greedo shoot first. This made a lot of nerds and geeks and dweebs everywhere very, very angry. Ever since then, most Star Wars fans have had a love-hate relationship with Mr. George, because many people believe that he should have left the originals untouched. Of course, all of that would be to service Lucas's ultimate vision, completing the prequel trilogy. In 1999, there was a very clever short film called George Lucas in Love, which was a parody of Shakespeare in Love, which George Lucas himself would enjoy, even sending the filmmakers a congratulatory letter. So now it was time for George Lucas to step behind the camera again and into the director's chair for the first time in 2 decades, to direct Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. The anticipation for this film was so massive that people slept out in front of the theaters for months before the tickets were even on sale. The Phantom Menace is probably the most anticipated film in the history of film. And then we saw it, and it was kind of boring and kind of annoying. But I mean, at the time, I loved it because I was a kid, and then I watched it again, but it is safe to say that a film with that much anticipation could never actually live up to the hype. And yeah, I mean, it's a solid film. It has its moments, I guess. But it did become one of the most hated movies ever upon its initial release. Ultimately, many people were just disappointed. To some, this felt like a mindless CGI puke fest, with a very generic story that practically retcons the original mythos. But whatever, it's fun. The pod race, yeah, okay. Yeah. Of course, The Phantom Menace would still manage to make over $1 billion at the worldwide box office, which would allow George Lucas to return for 2002's Attack of the Clones, where people would again line up around the block for tickets. But this time, Triumph the Insult comic dog was ready for them. The film would ultimately top out at $653.8 million worldwide, and had some interesting, thrilling battle sequences, but that dialogue, and I don't know, too much. It just felt like people were just standing in front of blue screens or green screens, and just the humanity was gone. Star Wars was awesome because it felt real and lived in. Now it just feels processed and rendered. Then in 2005, Lucas would make his final descent into the director's chair, when he brought his prequel trilogy to a close with Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. And even though the last two weren't exactly, good, the anticipation for this Episode 3 was still wild and crazy. But this one is not too bad. You can feel the drama more, the tension is elevated, I guess. Nice to see the story all tie together and kind of make sense, I guess. So yeah, this concluding chapter would receive the best reviews of the prequel trilogy, but I hear whispers that over time, this prequel trilogy has grown on some of the haters. They don't hate it as much. After watching it 1,000,000,000 billion times, they started to notice the brilliance behind it. They started to see that maybe there's some solid storytelling here. Or maybe they just like the memes. But to some of us, when you hear the words Star Wars and prequel in the same sentence, it makes us want to scream, "No!" The George Lucas backlash was so strong that many made careers off of hating Lucas. Hilarious careers. There was even a popular documentary called The People vs. George Lucas in 2010 that dared to ask the question, who really owned Star Wars? Mr. Lucas or the fans? And then came Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which further divided the fans from their beloved George. This horrendous, unnecessary installment to the Indiana Jones franchise had fans up in arms at the horrible CGI and the stupidness and that fridge. But audiences, despite saying that they hated it, still gave the film a healthy $790.7 million at the worldwide box office. But many people blamed George Lucas for the inclusion of aliens in the story, with many saying that it just didn't fit with the world of Indiana Jones. But I say it totally fits if you've ever seen an episode of Ancient Aliens.
What is this thing?
2008 would also see George Lucas return to the world of Star Wars for the animated film Star Wars: The Clone Wars. That would bridge the gap between the Attack of the Clones and the Revenge of the Sith. And this was followed by a highly successful TV series, run by other people. 2012 turned out to be a rather big year for George Lucas. He would help bring the story of the Tuskegee Airmen to the big screen with the film Red Tails, which is a solid history lesson of a film, and even though he didn't direct this film, it is cool to kind of see him involved in a World War II film, which these kind of dogfights inspired Star Wars, so you know, the circle of life. It's like a poem, it rhymes, I guess. In that same year of 2012, the year the Mayans warned us about, that he also sold his company Lucasfilm to Disney for a reported $4.05 billion with a B dollars. Billion. Lucas said that the decision was incredibly difficult and painful to make. Just imagine you're sitting there, and all you have in this world is the universe you created. And Mickey Mouse is there staring you in the eyes, holding $4 billion, waving it in your face and saying, "Come on, just give it to us. We swear we'll do right by it. We swear we won't fuck it up. Come on, George!" And ultimately, he did, saying that he just wanted to live a quote-unquote normal life with his billions of dollars. Basically, he was ready to retire. But the real question is, did Disney ruin the purity of Star Wars? Or did George Lucas already ruin the purity of Star Wars? Or was Star Wars ever pure? And is it okay if Disney makes like a million crappy Star Wars things as long as they make at least one decent one? Does that make it all worth it in the long run? These questions are enough to drive a man to the dark side. But I don't think we can blame George for that.
So there's a certain irony there, is that I have become the very thing that I was trying to avoid. That is Darth Vader. He becomes the very thing that he's trying to protect himself against.
And that is where we are with George Lucas. He sold off Lucasfilm, handed over the reins to Kathleen Kennedy, but they claim that his input is still incredibly valuable, even though I think they threw away like all of his ideas for the new sequel trilogy thing that happened. But he's not completely done. The dude did help direct the first episode of Season 8 of Game of Thrones, and you cannot help but notice that THX 1138 design influence in Andor. So yeah, I guess in a way the dude is still inspiring the new Star Wars stuff, And sometimes that new Star Wars stuff can be good sometimes. Also, because of that Disney Plus thing, there's a new Willow. Yeah, Willow is a thing again, but I haven't watched it, But good for them, and he is credited as the executive producer for Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, even though he's not involved in the film at all. And actually, George Lucas seems to be using his money for some good. He does a lot of charity work, and he's really dedicated to education. I think he gave a lot of money to the high school I went to, actually. What? This man is truly respected for the stories he helped create, and for the brilliant business moves he executed. And I'm sure all of the hate he gets probably hurts, he's human, allegedly. But he does seem to have a sense of humor about himself, because he seemed to have a really fun time voicing himself on Robot Chicken. I look at the works of George Lucas as a link between the past and the future. His art and his films evokes and pays homage to the past, which paved the way for our future. What I'm saying is that nobody is gonna cover up this man's American Graffiti. Not you, not me, not Mickey Mouse, and not even George Lucas himself can ruin the legacy of George Lucas, no matter how hard he tries. And that is why nobody should give a f*** about what the f*** happened to George Lucas, because he's doing just fine.